Coming up, as the Brooklyn Nets prepare for the upcoming season, we take a look at two key veterans in Royce O'Neal and Dorian Finney-Smith. Is now the time to get whatever value you can rather than holding on to what could be depreciating assets later in the season? We better get all down coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie. He's the owner-operator of DFSR for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht breaking down the New Jersey Devils on the Devils Puck Luck podcast with Danny McDonough. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We are free, absolutely free on all those great platforms. And Doug, what feels like a slowly dying narrative around this team is once upon a time the most critical decisions this organization was trying to make. What to do with Royce O'Neal and Dorian Finney-Smith. We're going to get into should they move on from them, why they should keep them, and if there is the right trade partner out there in the NBA.
Yeah, this was a topic that we talked about a lot in the offseason and even from the trade deadline. It's like, so what is the future? Well, not Dorian Finney-Smith because he came at the trade deadline, but so what's the future with guys like Royce O'Neal and now Dorian Finney-Smith with a team that has made a pretty definitive mini pivot, like sort of away from veteran talent and more into youth and just sort of rebuilding along a different timeline. And I'll just say it right now, I'm like, in some ways shocked that Royce O'Neal specifically is still on the team and feel like this deal probably already should have been done. And that Dorian Finney-Smith probably should also be on the move pretty actively here. And I think we might disagree a little, but in general, I wonder a little bit if Marks has overvalued these guys a little bit if there were potential talks that because we've heard about them in talks plenty of times, right? Like they're actively shopping them, that they're asking really high prices. And I get concerned that not only should these guys have already been moved, but that there's maybe a disconnect between the perceived value and actual value of what they are in the trade market, and that the Nets should maybe even consider taking less.
Yeah, it's funny, man, because especially around, you mentioned the deadline, and we said this about Seth Curry, right? that was as big a talking point of just moves the Nets should have made, right? Being more active. And when it comes to Dorian Finney-Smith, you said, will we disagree? On Dorian Finney-Smith, whether I'm a little bit split on it. I think if you change his role, then I feel differently about it. Remember, even at 30 years old, the contract is still very team friendly. He can still be a nice piece for them. Arguably with Royce O'Neal, and why I agree with you, is that he fits in to a lot of situations very well, right? He is the ideal depth piece for a championship caliber team, for a deep playoff run team. And you actually kind of saw him show that even for the Brooklyn Nets, right? He goes from playing as a pseudo backcourt member, bringing it up at points and being the effective point guard. Then he's playing small ball five. He's being used all over the place. And combined with the fact that he's on the 1 year, $9.5 million, right? His value is eventually just going to evaporate because he won't be on the team anymore. So in his specific instance, I agree. Should have already probably moved him. And just as a quick reminder, the Nets sent out a first-round pick to get him when it was the Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving Brooklyn Nets. He was supposed to be that supplemental piece for that championship version of a roster. So I think that factors in here too. Whether or not Dorian Finney-Smith was the byproduct of the best you could get from Dallas and the Kyrie deal, maybe. But again, at just over $13 million, there still is value there, even if he's clearly on the older side and not going to necessarily find some new gear to his game here.
Yeah, the Royce O'Neal thing, like I feel like, again, this is a compliment to him, is that he was a very good player for the Nets last season. He's been remarkably consistent throughout his career. I mean, his lines basically look the same year over year.
Mm-hmm.
The points went up a little with the Nets, but in general, the guy's just like 38 to 39% on lock from three, even no matter the attempts. The free throw percentage went down a little bit. Who cares? It doesn't take enough. Rebounding has been basically in that 5 range the whole time. Like he's just done the same exact stuff every single year. And it's important with his age being 30 years old and the very strong likelihood that they are not going to re-sign him under any circumstances. These are the reasons why I'm just so sort of head scratching around again, like A, why he's on the team, and B, like what Marks is actually asking there in the market. Because if you said it as, we paid a first rounder, he's the same guy, we want a first rounder back or whatever it is, unprotected or whatever, it wouldn't be unprotected, whatever. Like, I wonder if that has influenced the decision more than the reality. Because go back when they traded for Royce O'Neal and they gave up the first. We were like, oh, that seems like a lot, right? Like, even at the time, right? Like, it seemed like a lot at the time. So
even for what he was going to be for that team, it was still, first round pick. Okay. Yeah.
And then Kevin Durant, remember, asked for a trade like 10, 20 seconds later, that made it all the weirder. But in general, I think we were of the mind that was a slight overpay even at the time. So if you're anchored in this, like, we gave up a first, so we want a first for Royce, I just not sure that's like the reality of the situation. And I just don't see a part where he's a part of the future of the team. So I just don't understand like exactly what's happening. And just remember too, like he became the 6th man last year. His role was reduced. Like it wasn't like he was even a huge part of what they did late in the season when they brought in the new group. Again, he did not even start with that group.
Yeah.
Now you bring Simmons back. I don't know. I'm just confused about why he's still on the squad. And
you actually make a good point.
Go ahead.
No, on Royce as well, not only with the reduced role and going from being a starter and then all of a sudden coming off the bench when you brought in some of the new players, Spencer Dinwiddie, Dorian Finney-Smith, obviously along with Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson. But then on top of that, one of the things that we like about or love about Royce O'Neal is that defensive value that he brings, right? He had some nice clutch moments in shots from the outside. Royce O'Neal was a very good when he was on 3-point shooter and very unfortunate when he was off 3-point shooter, right? So the offensive consistency in game doesn't really give you more of what you need, more athleticism, more on-ball creation, right? So you don't get that from Royce in that regard. And then look at what they did this offseason. Again, not one-to-ones, but you brought in more defensive value. So you solidified an area of the game where you actually think he impacts at the highest. So all of those factors being a part of it makes, again, for me, Royce O'Neal the clear-cut guy that the Nets should be looking to move here. Dorian Finney-Smith, you can continue to state your case here as we move forward. Coming up in a second, I'm going to go ahead and throw out a handful of teams for Doug to go ahead and check off on as we'll call him the assistant GM in this scenario, moves where I would think Royce O'Neal is good for the team we send him to and also represents value for the Brooklyn Nets coming back. We dive into that next.
All right, before we get into that, tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel. You can get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets. That's up to $200. $20 down, you can land $200 in bonus bets. And here's what you're going to love to hear. Win or lose, FanDuel's got you covered where that is concerned. If you head over to FanDuel right now, look, MLB, they got this figured out every single different way, right? You can get same game parlays going on. You can get some quick bets in. You can bet for just the first 5 innings of a game. If you don't even want to sit around for the whole thing, they got you there. Hits, runs, strikeouts, alt lines. It's all there for you on FanDuel. They got some basketball stuff up there as well with our friend Mikal Bridges as the leader right now for the most improved player. So let's hammer that one as well. Maybe you want to hit the over 37.5 wins total for the Nets over at FanDuel. It's all there for you on an app that's safe and secure. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball.
All right, we're talking about the Brooklyn Nets and moves that maybe should have already been made. We'll get to Dorian Finney-Smith here in a minute, simply because I think, yes, he could be moved, but no, I don't think he represents the same versatility value to other rosters around the league, and especially at his age, right? Not necessarily an athletic four so much as he does have defensive upside and some perimeter shooting when it's on. Royce O'Neal, Doug. I'm gonna give you a list of teams, and you just cherry pick which one you want me to paint the picture for. I've got Boston, Cleveland, Miami. I've got the Pelicans. I've got Minnesota, and I've got Memphis. Where do you want to go first?
Where is like a likely trade partner?
Yeah, you can tell me what you think is likely. You can ask me, what do you know, which one, who do you want to trade with? I'll tell you who they
well,
get.
you go
I'll tell
first. You go first, because I got a couple that I don't think are like as great matches now. But where do you think is a good one? And I can piggyback that.
Okay, a good one, yeah, because there's a couple in here that I don't think work out. Let's go to Minnesota first here. I'll stay Western Conference because you want to get them out of the East, obviously, if you're going to move them. If I said that Minnesota, who has a lot of size, arguably too much, but doesn't necessarily have, maybe they want to have a little more backcourt depth. Remember, they still have Mike Conley there. If I told you that you could send Royce O'Neal to Minnesota, money can't just be taken in for a draft capital, for Kyle Anderson, how would that land for you?
Oh yeah, but I would like it, but I don't think Minnesota would want to do it. I think Anderson ended up being pretty important to what they want to do. I do think Minnesota is an interesting partner for them to add more wing depth. They lost Taurean Prince. So I agree with you on balance around like that team in general probably would like him, but I think Kyle Anderson would not be something they would consider. He ended up becoming a pretty important part. So I agree with in concept, but I disagree that would be something they could realistically get back. I don't think that's correct.
And a tricky one in that regard, which is kind of be a theme for a lot of these teams, is that not everybody has just $9.5 million to take on the contract, where you'd say, hey, and by the way, Minnesota doesn't have a lot of draft capital either, right? Because they gave away everything they could possibly find in the cupboards to get one older center from Utah. You may know his name. I won't even say it out loud. The other good one that I'll go to here before we get one so you can say don't work out. How about Memphis as a trade partner? Now, this one I think is more interesting for a couple of reasons. When you look at Memphis, first of all, it's just Royce O'Neal represents a good fit, good depth, good value. They added Marcus Smart into their backcourt. Look at Royce O'Neal. More is going into the 3 kind of spot here for them, giving them some good depth and giving them something that complements some of the things that they have. When you think about even like a Luke Kennard, who is primarily going to be your perimeter shooter. Now, he showed tremendous value for them in the playoffs, by the way. But the reason why I like them is for 2 reasons. One, they have the better of Phoenix or Washington's 2024 first-round pick in addition to their own. So maybe they have a back-end first-round pick that doesn't mean as much to them. They could choose to go that route. And then they also have a couple of players, whether it's Brendan Clark, which I would be maybe less inclined to want to take on because it's a 4-year deal and it's $12.5 million as it stands right now. But even Zaire Williams, who seems to clearly be, a miss in terms of a prospect that you wanted to see develop, that represents to me a longer term flyer. If you talk about a guy like Williams, you say, hey, he's still young. You have 2 years of control on him here, so you can give him a look and see if there's something that you can reestablish, regain value, as Sean Marks has done in the past.
Yeah, this one lines up a little bit more just in needing like sort of wing depth, and they've been hunting for this like sort of desperately for a time now. And I mean, Smart solves it a little, but not really, right? But they also clearly are in a championship window right now, and I'm sure that's how they see themselves. And the 3/4 has been a problematic area for them for a bunch of different reasons. Like Kennard can shoot threes, but he's not good enough on defense. Like Santi Aldama played pretty well for them, but I'm not sure he's a guy that can close super high leverage games. So it's John Conchar has been good, and he's probably going to start at the 4 of the season, maybe to start with Ja out. I'm not really sure. And so this is like start at the 3, excuse me, with Ja out, but it's a confusing situation for them, but it's clear that they've needed these kinds of guys. I've long thought that this was one that lined up. Their problem is they might be saving some of these assets for a real move, right? Like a big, if Toronto became a seller, adding an OG Anunoby or something like that, or so they might just be keeping powder dry to not make one of these sort of mini moves, but saying, and they did some of this with Smart, right? They unloaded some assets to get Marcus Smart in the door, but they might be saving the rest of it for an all-in kind of move. And I'm not sure Royce represents that, even if he is a decent match, I think, for what they're doing. So I think that's a good partner. I do wonder if this has been one of the teams that's hey, we're not giving up for a first for him, right? But we would give up something else, and this would be the disconnect. So I could definitely see that being the case.
And by the way, I'll put in the caveat in these discussions of saying, you mentioned the first round pick that the Nets spent to get him. Now they're talking about setting a high benchmark for return what they want for him. These are scenarios, whether it's for a player to make sure the money works out, obviously, or for draft capital. it's okay if a team wants to give you a couple of second-round picks for Royce O'Neal. Like, if you're the Brooklyn Nets, at some point, you just have to accept that getting value matters here, even if it's not the value that you had set going forward. The last team, I'm trying to think. Well, you know what? The last team that I'll put in here just quickly would be Miami. And we've talked about this before, and then we'll talk about ones that wouldn't work. And I actually have a very interesting Eastern Conference scenario that I want to run by you too. But Miami just makes sense because they need this guy. They need this model of player. We've said this before. I wonder if it would be as simple as saying, simple being a key word here, and maybe it actually costs the Nets a little something, a guy like Nikola Jovic, to say we want this young piece, we want this young guy that represents a need for us, what that deal would look like in terms of actual cost for the Brooklyn Nets, and not just being, hey, we gave you Royce O'Neal, thanks so much. I wonder if the fan base would react favorably to saying, like, and it actually cost us, some second round draft capital or something to make this deal fully work and send Royce to Miami, which would be obviously perfect for them.
I think, as it constitutes now, they could really use him. The problem with them is, you can't see them unloading assets, going into needing to keep everything in case they need to get Dame, right? So it's like they have nothing to unload. Right. They can't make any marginal moves. They already don't have enough to get Lillard. And so giving out any other assets prior to that makes it really tough. And after losing Max Strus, they lost Gabe Vincent. They lost some key pieces here in the offseason and didn't really replace them with anybody. And so now Miami's been the best ever at just, I guess I take it back. They brought in Josh Richardson, which actually that kind of cuts into the O'Neal thing a little bit. But in general, who's been better? Who's been better at just taking guys you've never heard of and making them into real players than the Heat? So you never know what they're sort of cooking up in terms of who they think is next man up. But I do agree with you that they would be a good partner. But I get worried that they're just not interested in making any marginal move as they wait to hopefully win the staring contest for the Dame thing, right? So it's tough. I get it. But this is where this is my point about O'Neal, though. And we can talk about DFS here next. But my point about Royce O'Neal is, if it doesn't look like there's just tons of options, you might have to take a little less, right? Because to have him walk out the door here at the end of the season, a la Seth Curry, right? That was so clear they needed to trade him. You just might need to take less. It sucks. I get it, but to lose it for nothing makes even less sense.
And coming up here in a second, as you say, we'll talk about some teams that I think fans would want to put out, but just don't make sense for some very specific reasons. Maybe there's still a spot where they can find that space. And ultimately, around Dorian Finney-Smith and Royce O'Neal, what is the case why they should not move either of these players given the Brooklyn Nets' short-term goals? We dive into that next. Okay, so briefly, the one other team, obviously, that had been talked about a lot was the Cavs. There's a connection there with Donovan Mitchell. The only way that you kind of get that done is maybe around something like a Okoro. It just doesn't, Cleveland is restricted in terms of what they have, their cap flexibility, etc.
And they real quick, they added Max Strus and George Niang in the offseason, and kind of I thought they were a good match before those two moves. Those two moves sort of take O'Neal out of the picture for me.
Yeah. The last one I'll ask you about before you can hit the ones that don't make sense if you had any other ones. I had New Orleans on here, and I don't know. I was talking about Gary Clark, or they have some of their own. They have now the Pelicans do have some of their own first round draft capital. Next year they have their own LA's and Milwaukee's. So you're talking about potentially in the Lakers and the Bucks, 2 very late first round picks. Now again, that's assuming that first round value still exists for Royce O'Neal in the NBA landscape.
In terms of Dorian Finney-Smith too, do you see him as a different situation because the contract goes 3 years out, that? O'Neal is expiring here after the season, but Dorian Finney-Smith is controlled through this year and next year at $15 million, and then he's got a player option at 15 in 25-26. I feel like he's likely to pick that up, but I'm not positive about that. Do you see him as just a different situation because of the contract situation, the 3 years of cost control stuff, and maybe just keeps your floor higher now? I don't know. He's for sure a different situation.
Yeah, to me, so the difference is, okay, Royce O'Neal is the example, expiring contract. Well, if you go into this season, what if Royce O'Neal gets hurt? Done. The value is lost. It's over. You can't move him. No one's going to take him on. By the way, as frustrated as we were around Curry, remember, he had injuries all throughout the start of the year, right? So the Brooklyn Nets were maybe thinking about it, but other teams were probably looking and saying, am I gonna give you anything for a guy that's now dealing with, a couple of different injuries? So Royce O'Neal, I think there's the risk there. Dorian Finney-Smith, there's a world where, and maybe even ideally, because we talked about this, well, if Ben Simmons comes back healthy and Dorian Finney-Smith gets moved into a bench role, well, now all of a sudden his value may be reestablished and maximized for a team around the league, where I think putting him in the starting lineup after the trade, it looked okay at times. It also wasn't the perfect fit. So maybe you actually create at that 13.5 million and you have some control of him. I think another team could look at that and say, yeah, he's the right piece. And point being there is, I don't think that a team comes calling Brooklyn for Dorian Finney-Smith thinking he's coming into their starting rotation. I think they come looking for him as being a high depth add for their roster. So yeah, I think there's the difference that you can wait. You can wait till the deadline with Dorian Finney-Smith because you have length on the contract.
Yeah, and I think that, I wonder too, the length of the contract, he's a little more defensively versatile. I actually wonder if there's going to be times where we see Dorian Finney-Smith play like small ball 5 for this team more. I know fans don't want to hear that. I mean, just if you look at the numbers from last year, he played 223 minutes last year with no Claxton and no Day'Ron Sharpe on the court, right? And so they had him for a lot of minutes, and we saw this in the playoffs against the Sixers too. Like, he was the center. I know that fans, that drives them nuts, but small ball at times is fine. So the versatility for him is a little bit of a different situation. The contract situation is a little, I think, is a little more advantageous for the Nets right now. So I think for all those reasons, for the same way, I just don't. I think though there is a world though where they get to the trade deadline this year. Maybe you're getting a little more from some of these other guys. And if the opportunity presents itself, you have to trade him. Like you have to, if there's any opportunity to trade him for like a first round pick, I think you just kind of have to do it. Right.
Yeah.
Versatility be damned. I just don't know a world where that's not a good idea sort of for what he is and where the future is for this team.
And that's ultimately where I think we can wrap up the show here, is on what it means to make a move like this. Royce O'Neal, Dorian Finney-Smith, right? You're opening up holes potentially in your roster. And we talked about this we've talked about on other episodes around expectations for this season, right? How many games do you want to win? Making sure you're in the playoffs. If you move out now, and you can debate about whether or not the intention is for Dorian Finney-Smith to be in the starting lineup this year versus what he was last year, but you're still taking away 55 minutes out of your rotation from a year ago at 30 minutes for 30 plus minutes for Dorian Finney-Smith, 25 minutes for Royce O'Neal. If you make these moves, and I'll put it this way. I know that all fans say, well, you don't have control of your own draft picks, so tanking isn't a viable option. I'm not saying that tanking is the right option. However, I don't think that you can afford to be too committed on competitive basketball this year that you don't maximize the value for either one of these guys on the trade market, right? Like, at some point you have to say, we got to get what we can get for these guys. We need to make sure that we continue to fill in either young talent or draft capital. And that may come at the cost of where you finish this upcoming season, right? Because none of these scenarios I laid out are going to bring back a starting caliber player or a 25, 30-minute player that are likely. So that I think is the ultimate question here for the Brooklyn Nets, and why I wonder what happens. Because once you move one or two of these guys, you're looking and saying, what? Hey, Jalen Wilson, it's your time to shine, right? You're looking around the roster and asking the question, who fills in these gaps?
And we already went through this once, and we went through it just only a few months ago, where the Nets should have been probably sellers. Maybe they just ran out of time, right? After the KD and Kyrie thing could have possibly caught them a little off guard, or they were trying to wrap other moves together and just, the clock ran out.
Yep.
But we already saw it once that this a quasi commitment to winning in the face of just no real great reason cost them almost for sure some assets at the trade deadline. It's hard to imagine that they didn't. Think being in that same mindset this year, just for winning's sake, I think would be problematic to some degree if it didn't think about getting off some of these guys for future assets, which you desperately still need. I know the Nets have reloaded nicely, but they're still probably not all the way there in terms of where they are overall as a team, about what they should have tried to accrue in terms of just long-term assets. And winning a few more games at the cost of sending out guys that clearly probably should be traded and are not part of a future movement for the team would be another massive mistake. And understanding that we thought this last year, we thought it was a mistake. They went through with it. once it was done, it was like, okay, well, we might as well root for him. But it was still a mistake at the trade deadline to not do it. And
Right.
I get a little worried that would be the case. I will say one thing, last thing. I'm more encouraged that they moved off of like Harris and Patty Mills. Like that they already did those things does make me at least a little encouraged that they see it, because they've done it a couple times now, right? Where it's like, hey, to send off these other guys to get off the contract. So I believe they have it in them a little more than I did before. Because before I wasn't even sure they had it in them.
Yeah, because we made the case that Patty Mills, Joe Harris, that they shouldn't have been here already going into last season, potentially, depending on what your perspective was. Then let's also then cap it with this question, and I'll answer it first. Should the Brooklyn Nets, if the return is in the spectrum, maybe a first-round pick in next year's draft and a second-round pick, let's say that's all you get for one or both of these guys, would you make those moves if you are the Brooklyn Nets, knowing what it means to the short-term outlook for this team? For me, I answer the calls, and anything that's within reason, I probably say yes to. And then I turn around and I say, hey, Darius Baisley, we brought you in to get a look at you. We're going to get a really good look at you. Day'Ron Sharpe, we're going to get a really good look at you. Hey, guess what? We talked about this last week. Cam Thomas, we're going to get a really good look at you, right? Like, we're just going to accept that the value on these veterans is now. And it does mean that we're going to take a bit of a gamble on what this season looks like. And that's okay. If another team is going to get better first round value because they have our pick, so be it. Because we cannot do this throwing good money after bad here and always thinking about what we did 2 and 3 years ago and how it impacts us now.
Yeah, I agree. I think that should be the case. And I look, with the understanding that I think Royce and DFS are slightly different guys here. The timelines are different, right? There are slightly different considerations. There's a world where, Dorian Finney-Smith, like, playing to the trade deadline this year, and if he's shooting the lights out of the ball, and like that, he's a guy that I can see the value going back up on, right, in a pretty significant way. Royce O'Neal, maybe he's in the same boat, like in terms of they play really well to start this season. Maybe the value goes up a little bit. And here's the one other thing too, going into the trade deadline, you just know there's just different teams involved in this at the trade deadline than there are now, right? This landscape will change. It will change. That is always a certainty. The teams that we think are going to be great now, sometimes things happen, right? So I think there is some value to waiting, but I think they have to do something at some point, right? I don't think you can just play it. I don't think they should play it all the way out.
And I will just say, quick caveat is the waiting game can also end up having teams that are contenders to start the year being sellers at the deadline. And that can end up muddying the market a little bit just in terms of who's available. But this will be a fascinating watch. And obviously, we'll see how it plays out and how it impacts this team. I've always been a youth guy, so you're never gonna hurt my feelings by saying young dudes get more minutes here as the Nets get some future draft capital.
All right, we're going to get out of here. Much appreciated. Everyone that's been on the Locked On Nets train here through the offseason. Continue to see the numbers grow, man. It's just been amazing. Like this summer compared to last summer, already just so much better since everyone's on board here. It's amazing. Make sure you are part of the crew as well. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets on YouTube. Subscribe to wherever you listen to the Locked On Nets on the podcast.
Why are you punishing me? That's not the Brooklyn Nets fan base. That's John Rambo from First Blood.
Ooh, one of the all-time great poets. We're back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball.